Hello, and welcome to Books of the World. This is a series of programs in which we interview authors, and it's produced by the Cape Cod Writers Center. I'm Ray Cormier, I'm your host today, and I'm joined today by Judah Leblang, who's here to talk about his memoir, Finding My Place, One Man's Journey from Cleveland to Boston and Beyond. Thanks for coming to the Cape and joining us, Judah.
Thank you, I'm glad to be here.
Before we even talk about the book, you told me you're going to be back to the Cape this summer.
Yeah, I'm going to be actually teaching at the Writers Conference, at the Cape Cod Writers Conference. I was actually an attendee about 12, 13 years ago, and so I'm excited to be back teaching memoir at the conference. Great,
great. And before we go on, if anyone out there wants more information about the annual Cape Cod Writers Center Conference, which will be the first weekend in August, please go to capecodwriterscenter.org and you can find all the information there. But teaching is something you have a lot of experience doing, right?
Yeah, in my first life I was a special ed teacher. I taught deaf children in Cleveland and Columbus, Ohio, and then a little bit here in Massachusetts. And then I've taught a lot of other things. I taught some courses at BU in the business school, and in recent years I've been teaching memoir writing at a place called Grub Street, which is a nonprofit writing center in Boston, and I've been teaching at Grub for about 11 years now.
Okay. Let's turn to the book. I mean, really simplistically, it's a book about a boy growing up in a middle-class family in a predominantly Jewish suburb of Cleveland, a city that you have obvious affection for, and yet, later in life, I won't say fled, but left and ended up to come to Boston.
Right.
But it's more than just that. It's also a story of a journey of seeking self, in which you face reckoning, you say, being gay in a less than understanding world. Right? And it's also filled with a lot of great characters, mostly your family members. A lot of people have similar stories, but so what compelled you to actually put this down on paper and tell it formally?
Well, I think it was a process that came over time. When I was, I'd always had an interest in writing, and as I say in one of my shows, I want to tell stories and lack the imagination to make things up. So I was really working with my life material. So I always had an interest in doing it, and then in my late 30s, I was working as a sign language interpreter, which is very creative, but it's really about working with other people's language and other people's messages. And I realized that I need to put my own voice out into the world. So I started writing some short pieces, and I kind of found, writers, we talk about finding your voice, which is, kind of like your writing style on the page. When I started writing, as I was entering middle age, it seemed like I had this natural voice, which was often humorous and had a certain take on things. And so I started writing about a bunch of the experiences I had growing up in this little world outside of Cleveland, which was kind of like Brookline or Newton transposed to the Midwest. And also about my connection with Cleveland, because even though I left a number of years ago, I've been away for like 30 plus years, but I go back often, and I've always had an affinity for the underdog. And I think that's a theme that runs through the book because of, my various groups and identities as a gay, Jewish, hard of hearing man. I've always related to outsiders. And so I think the theme in the book about finding my place, a lot of it isn't so much about Cleveland or Boston, but it's more of an internal thing about kind of finding my voice is really, I think, what the book is about.
Right. And you talk about writing vignettes, and this is not a typical memoir in that it is made up of a series of semi-independent vignettes and poems, mostly in chronological order to give it a sense of an autobiography. How did you settle on that? And decide to do it that way?
Well, it was really about a 10-year process. I was struggling to develop a memoir. Really, it's not really designed to be an autobiography, which typically autobiography is written by somebody who is, I don't know, Madeleine Albright or Barack Obama, somebody who has a life of significant accomplishment, who is generally well known, which I am not. But I found that for me, I think the most accessible part of writing, and also a way to get published, was to write short pieces. And then, so I wrote little clips about my grandfather, who was a pharmacist in Cleveland for 50 years, or my uncle, who was deaf and who never really fit into the deaf or hearing worlds, and various experiences I had as a single gay man, dating disasters, various things. And so it just seemed to be my natural form to write short. And over time, I got some of these pieces on public radio. I had a number of them published in Boston and Cleveland. And so I realized that I could weave them together in a way that if you did read them chronologically, if I set them up the right way, it would read like a memoir, but they were kind of individual digestible chunks. So one of my friends had two young girls at the time, and he said, I can basically read one of these while the kids are in the tub, when I'm in them. Or, so it's designed, I think, in a way for people who maybe are busy and don't have a lot of time to just be losing themselves in a book. They can have a complete piece, and then when they have time, they can go back and read the rest. So that's why they most of them can stand alone. But I think if somebody does read it from beginning to end, at least the first two parts, they'll have a sense of being on a journey. The third part of the book is a little bit different because that's really my one-man show, which grew out of the book.
Right. You say one-man show. I should mention that you have developed a second career, as it were, as a storyteller, doing this show based on these vignettes, right?
Yeah, I mean, I found that when I really started writing seriously, it was about 20 years ago. I was in my early 40s, and I had the opportunity to read pieces in bookstores and libraries and places like that, and I just found it really gave me a lot of energy. I really loved it. As a writer, getting immediate feedback from people in the room, as opposed to, it's nice when somebody reads my work, but this gave me a chance to put it out in my own voice, which I really liked. And one dream of mine from many years ago was to actually, I'd been interested in being an actor, and when I was in high school and college, decided that probably wasn't very practical, and I didn't really have the confidence to do it. And so I thought about taking some of these pieces off the page, which would mean that I would really have to memorize them, and I would have to put them together in a different way to work as performance pieces. And I worked with a director, and the first time I did a show was about 6 years ago at the Cambridge Center for Adult Education, and the show actually sold out. I mean, it wasn't a huge hall. There were about 70 people, but I was wicked terrified because it's one thing, I'm comfortable doing readings where I have the the words in front of me, but here it was basically just me. I had a friend who was doing lights and another friend who was doing sound, but I was up there, and I just didn't know for sure if I could really remember the stuff. But there are a few little glitches, but it wasn't Broadway, and it went pretty well. And I've been doing the show, I've probably done it 30, 35 times by this point, and now I'm working on a new show, which is kind of further adventures in middle age, which I'll be doing for the first time at two Canadian fringe festivals, one in Regina, Saskatchewan, and one in Winnipeg, Manitoba in July.
Oh, very good.
So I'm working on memorizing the new show.
Good. Did you find you had to change the writing very much for the show?
It's an interesting process. I find that, I guess the answer would be yes and no. It's a matter of finding the rhythm. A lot of people have told me that my work has a certain rhythm on the page, so that people who know me when they're reading, they say, oh, I could hear you doing it in my mind. But of course, most people reading the book wouldn't know me, but I think they would find there's a certain flow. However, something can work on the page, and sometimes, one of those 25-cent words, which I try not to use too often, can be very effective in really pinpointing what I'm trying to say. But in spoken word, in a performance piece, it just may not flow. So I find that when I memorize my pieces and when I start working with them physically, I'll often do another level of editing. I may move some things around. I'll often cut words. It has to be, to me, a little, just tightened in a different way, and it has to work kind of acoustically, tonally, and even kinesthetically. So I would say generally, yes, I do a fair amount of editing there.
Good. Interestingly, though, going back to the actual writing of a memoir, you say in your author's note, and let me quote, it says, "This book is a work of creative fiction."
Creative nonfiction.
Nonfiction, excuse me. And what follows is essentially true, quote unquote. Was that your approach from the start, or did you just somehow fall into that?
Well, I mean, as a writer, I'm not a fiction writer, and of course a lot of authors' first books, if they call them fiction, sometimes they're autobiographical fiction. But for me, I felt like telling some of these stories, like, again, I have a piece about my grandfather. My grandfather was an interesting guy. One of the things about him, his name was Papa, we called him Papa Ben. He had this drugstore in the Polish neighborhood in Cleveland. It was open every day for 50 years. So something about my grandfather, and I wanted to have those specifics in there, and I wanted his name to be in there. And so I wanted to bring these people to life. I did change names of some people, but in the case of like my grandfather or my grandmother who are deceased, I did use their real names. I wanted them to be seen. And at the same time, there's always that discussion of where's the line between truth and fiction. And so I have a little bit of a disclaimer at the beginning of the book because, I'm writing about things sometimes from 40, 50 years ago. My memory is inherently subjective, and sometimes I fleshed out scenes, minor details, or move things around a little bit in time. But the main events in the book all happened. And what I'm trying to do is really to convey what I call emotional truth, to give the reader or listener a sense of the world that I come from, and then my experiences in the latter part of the book as a single gay man who's kind of trying to find his place in the world. So that to me is really what creative nonfiction means to me.
Right. So you did think about the idea of how much accuracy a memoirist owes his or her readers.
Right. I thought about that a lot. A lot of writing teachers. In fact, in this class I just taught yesterday at Grub Street, or actually, yeah, it was on yesterday morning. We were talking about that issue of where's the line between truth and fiction, and the contract with the reader. What do we as nonfiction writers owe to the reader, and how do we need to signal them if we're imagining, say, when like my grandfather met my grandmother or something like that. So I'll usually put in something like I conjure an image, or I create a scene. I'll kind of tell the reader, or I do research, trying to interview people who can tell me what was happening at that time, family members if they're still around. But I do think that different writers will draw that line in different places. You won't. I don't think you would get a consistent answer as to exactly where you draw the line between what you can say as what you can call nonfiction and what you could call, say is over the line. I mean, there was a big case about 10 years ago with the writer James Fry.
Right.
That was clearly way over the line, right? Because he was basically saying that he had done things or things had happened to him that had not happened to him. But I think between that and journalism, there's a gray area. I'm somewhere in that gray area, but I think it's every nonfiction writer's job to at least struggle with that question and really think about it And so I'm not sure that I always made the right decision, but I definitely struggled with it.
Okay. The book has 3 sections, and the first is entirely about your youth in and around Cleveland. You describe it as a fading city, almost with a sense of insecurity about itself. For example, I think this is kind of a good example. You write, "My mother once told me of visiting the Great Lakes Exposition, a mini World's Fair, held downtown on Cleveland's Mall in the mid-30s. Then there was the great parade after the Indians championship a decade later. But yet when I was growing up, there were no great celebrations, no eruptions of civic pride, only explosions of rage and sighs of disappointment, which seemed to mirror those in my own life." It seems, though, that the most intimate feelings of civic insecurity involve some of your beloved sports teams. Is that just a sort of a way of expressing that general civic insecurity?
I mean, I think if you go to Cleveland, it's like you'd understand. I mean, people traditionally, I think, almost apologize for the city. Didn't have a good reputation. When I was in college, I remember they went into bankruptcy. We were the first large American city to fall into bankruptcy since the Depression. This was like in the late 70s. It's still known for the river catching fire, which it used to do periodically. Now, I was just back there. People are rowing and boating on the river. I mean, there's still some industry there, but there's actually fish, and it's much, much cleaner, kind of like the Charles is here. And I think people in Cleveland have moved beyond like the burning river, although they've named a beer after it. They kind of own it now. But it's only really been in the last few years when I go back that I actually see it shifting, and people there actually seem to have a lot more sense of pride. Partly when Leblang came back, and the fact that they won a championship 2 years ago, that was the first time, almost in my lifetime, that a Cleveland team had won a championship. We're talking like 52 years. And I happened to be back in Cleveland that weekend. And I was so nervous, I couldn't even watch the game. I was pacing, this is true, I was walking up and down the street near where I was staying, and I'm listening for people yelling from the houses and the restaurants, because the Cavs were losing by 1 point. And I've seen with the Indians, actually last year, or 2 years ago as well, we got to the 7th game of the World Series and we lost in extra innings. I mean, so close. The Browns were close in the late 80s, but we would always find a way to lose. So there is that thing. So somehow they broke the curse, and I actually wrote a little piece which was in the Cleveland, or on the Cleveland paper website, and it was just amazing to finally see that come to fruition. But yeah, I mean, I think, again, I have this affinity for the underdog, and the teams were part of it. When I was growing up, we were one of the first cities to have major riots. This was like 1966, and there are neighborhoods in Cleveland that have never recovered from the late 60s. So there was that. But at the same time, I always felt like underneath it there was a lot more. And you just have to know where to look. Oh. And when I go back, I'll see, I mean, the city has amazing cultural resources, like the incredible art museum, which is on a par with the MFA, if not better. Severance Hall, where the orchestra plays. There's a lot of cool things there, but you have to know where to look.
Right.
So I write about that.
You also write about several interesting family members. I was most interested, I think, in your Uncle Jerry, who you mentioned, who was deaf, and your godmother, Donna. Can you speak just a couple of minutes about them and how important, the important roles they played in your life?
So I have a very small family. My only uncle was born deaf, and I didn't see him that often, but as a kid, I just felt a real connection with him. I think because Jerry was different. He had deaf speech. He could speak, but you'd have to, you had to be used to his voice, and he was profoundly deaf. I mean, he had no hearing at all. And he had learned to kind of get by in life, but it was hard because, he had been educated orally, so he didn't really use sign language, and then, some people had trouble understanding him, and so he didn't fit in either the deaf or hearing worlds, and I didn't understand all of that when I was a kid, but I got that he was kind of isolated, and I just felt this connection between us. And he actually died of a heart attack at 44, which I believe is from all the frustration of not being accepted and not really being able to be who he was. I went on after he died to study deaf education. I taught deaf children for 8 years. That was my first career. And then years later, I went back, relearned sign language from deaf people, and was a sign language interpreter for several years, which kind of led me to become a writer. So that's the story with Jerry.
And Donna also was a person who strove through some tough situations that you grew close to also.
So Donna worked for my family as, what we called a cleaning lady. And she was an African-American woman from the South who had had a lot of rough, she had had a rough life. She was, I don't know, again, we developed a connection. I think I was really more aware of the connection as an adult with her because she was around until about 10 years ago. And, as I got older, I would go back to Cleveland, I would visit her, I'd spend a lot of time with her, got to know her family, she was one of these people that hadn't had a lot of formal education, but she had school of life wisdom, and I ended up speaking at her son's funeral, which was a whole other story. I was the only white person there, and the minister introduced me as her other son who had come all the way from Boston. Meanwhile, her grandchildren, the children of her real son, were there, and I'm thinking, how are they viewing this? We were all adults by that time. But they were actually very kind to me. I mean, I think they knew that I really loved their grandmother, and we had this heart connection, and yeah, she passed away about 12 years ago, but she's still part of my life. And
it's a beautiful section of the book.
Thank you.
Before we close up, I want to give you an opportunity to show the viewers a little bit of what you do on stage.
So what comes next other than old age? I've got 5 years before I get there, or 10, depending on the line of demarcation. In the meantime, I'm in the middle, the in-between, the DMZ. Growing older, I've read, is about making peace with our lives, accepting that we can't have it all. Life is about making choices and accepting the consequences. I know now that I will not become a famous writer or an actor, which was my dream back when I was a little boy and thought I could do anything, and later briefly in high school. I won't have a boyfriend to share my 30s or my 40s, won't have the dream body I might have sculpted within the limits of my lean jeans if only I'd spent more time at the gym. So what comes next? Have you given up yet? A woman asked me about my search to find a partner. She and I had bonded in group therapy in the late 1980s when I was in graduate school, majoring in depression, anxiety, and career counseling, respectively. No, I haven't, I said. You see, I've always been a late bloomer, so I remind myself on a daily basis. And I'm not ready to admit defeat, not when I haven't had a real relationship, one with requited love, one lasting longer than 6 months. I want to meet that man now, today, this week. I am the youngest, most youthful, least dilapidated I will ever be in this lifetime. I'm like a split-level home from the 1950s, dated but with character, a fixer-upper with potential. Still, I hear the drumbeat calling my name, pulling me in a direction I do not want to go, rolling toward the abyss. These are not original thoughts. Have you heard any of this before? Do you wonder who will whisper sweet nothings in your ear in a year or bring your bedpan in 10? Still, I'm special, unique, with my own brand of neuroses. You see, we're each like crazy mixtures in God's test tube, and the jury is still out as to whether my particular formula is a keeper or should be sent back to quality control. I never pictured myself as an old man, but I didn't see myself as a 60-year-old either. Living with depression, a truckload of anxiety thrown in, I couldn't imagine myself 1 year into the future, much less 10. Now that I can, what comes next?
And thank you again for coming down to the Cape, sharing the story of your life with us.
My pleasure.
And tell the viewers again where they can find out information about buying the book and also about your performances.
Okay, I'll be happy to do that. So basically, if they want to get a copy of my book, the easiest way would be probably to go, they go to my website, which is just judahleblang.com, my name, JUDAHLEBLANG.com. There's a link so that they could get a book. It's also on Amazon, but I always encourage people to get it from me because Amazon takes a large cut. And again, I'll be teaching at the conference the first weekend in August, at the Writers' Conference. And if they want to see some of my show, again, I have some clips on my website.
Very good. Again, thank you for sharing your story with us. And thank you for joining us on Books in the World. See you next time.